We now turn to the legislative update portion of this conference with presenter Greg Murad, who has worked with the National Right to Work Committee for more than 24 years. Greg is the committee's Vice President of Legislation. In that role, he is responsible for directing the committee's efforts to advance the cause of employee freedom in Congress and in the 50 states. Greg not only leads the way on such bills in Congress as the National Right to Work Act, the Freedom from Union Violence Act, and Truth in Employment Act, he oversees the committee's candidate survey program for congressional candidates. Greg will be providing us with our annual update on current federal and state legislation of interest to Right to Work supporters.
Thanks, Amanda. It's good to get a chance to be with you all and to give you a quick update on what's going on legislatively here in Washington as well as around in the states. So at the federal level, it's been an interesting environment with Joe Biden in the White House proudly declaring himself to be big labor's #1 fan. He and the administrative state have been doing everything they can to boost the prospects for big labor running roughshod over everybody else. However, since they lost control of the House, there's been a little bit more of a roadblock in the way of their completely radical agenda, and it's given us the opportunity to go back on offense. So we have once again reintroduced the National Right to Work Act. We've got 92 co-sponsors at the moment between the House and the Senate. Our lead sponsor is Rand Paul in the Senate and Joe Wilson in the House, just like last time. And we are continuing to recruit more co-sponsors as we deliver more petitions and postcards and the grassroots activity comes in, as well as my staff and I working Capitol Hill, talking to the legislative staff and encouraging them to get on board and explaining why this is a good issue and a winning issue. Obviously, we are not so delusional as to think that we can enact that bill this year. We don't have 60 votes in the Senate, and Joe Biden certainly wouldn't sign it if we could get it to him. But just by putting the politicians on record as co-sponsors and raising the profile of the issue, maybe even getting some hearings in the House, we get the ammunition we need to target the next crop of big labor's pet politicians come next year so that our supporters can hold them accountable when they fail to do the right thing and even more so when they go out and aggressively do the wrong thing. A number of other bills that we support every year that we're still working on, of course, the Freedom from Union Violence Act that closes the loophole in the federal Hobbs Anti-Extortion Act that lets union bosses get away with coordinating campaigns of violence and extortion. We typically get that introduced around Labor Day to highlight the fact that there's a significant difference between the union bosses and the actual laboring Americans that they exploit. Another bill that deals with the problem of union salting. The most prevalent and widespread example of salting going on right now is at Starbucks, where the SEIU in particular has been bragging about how many people they have on their payroll for the express purpose of trying to get jobs at Starbucks simply so they can vote for a union. Our anti-salting bill called the Truth in Employment Act would make it easier and more clearly and obviously legal for an employer to not hire somebody who's not actually interviewing for the job, but rather interviewing so they can get on the payroll and become an agitator. So that bill we've had introduced many years going now, and we're working with a couple of congressmen and senators to get it reintroduced again this year. I expect that'll probably come in pretty soon. We're also continue to be interested in a ban on what's called official time. That's where government employees can do union business, if they're also union officials, on the government clock, on the taxpayer's dime. It's an egregious practice of just a pure handout to big labor. That just should not be. If union bosses want to do union business, they should not be on the federal clock or the state taxpayer's clock to do it, and that's just wrong. So we've got a bill in there that would ban that practice at the federal level as well. We're also working with Senator Mike Lee and Congressman Austin Scott to introduce a bill that would strip the National Labor Relations Board of its judicial power. I should call it its quasi-judicial power because it doesn't really function as a judiciary in the sense of impartiality. It rather is a biased board. It's designed to be a biased board. By definition, the president's party gets a 3-2 majority. And so we end up with this situation where policy keeps flipping back and forth as the new majority sets precedents. Well, that's not exactly a legal environment that anybody can function in long term. And so we'd like to see that power taken away and given all of its so-called judicial authority back to the actual constitutional courts of our country where there's still some sense of actual justice being done rather than a politicized process that's really become more of a joke than anything else. In addition to that, Bob Good from Virginia has introduced a bill to repeal the so-called Davis-Bacon Act. In all of the states, they're usually called prevailing wage acts, which is designed to basically force unionization on usually construction projects funded with federal money or at the state level with state money. Drives up the costs of building schools and building roads and building new government buildings, really everything. Of course, the cost is not because they're paying more. In fact, the unions often manage to get away with paying less because the way these contracts work under Davis-Bacon is you got to abide by the union job classification rules too, which means that you can pay apprentices less if you have them, and you have to have a certain number. And guess who runs the apprenticeship programs? That would be big labor. So the whole thing is designed to jack up the cost to everybody while letting the unions still underbid most of their non-union competitors and featherbed the jobs with more union employees than the job actually requires, while making sure that the guy that swings a hammer isn't allowed to plug in an extension cord. It's an obscene system that we'd like to see done away with. Other measures at the federal level to deal with the issue of project labor agreements, where you have to turn your people over to a union even to bid on a job, a number of other issues like that, as well as trying to make darn sure there's no more bailouts of the bloated and mismanaged union pensions that Joe Biden managed to push through in his inflation bill last year. So lots going on the offensive front. There's, of course, there remain defensive fights in Congress as well. The unions are still pushing the so-called PRO Act, that massive smorgasbord of every bad idea big labor has dreamed up over the last 70 years, including card check unionization, where they wouldn't need a secret ballot vote to unionize a workplace, including binding arbitration on first contract, so some government bureaucrat could tell companies and employees the terms under which they'll be working rather than leaving it up to negotiation, including, most egregiously of all, of course, the repeal of all existing state right-to-work laws and making it so we could never have one again. That bill had passed the House in the previous Congress. It was pretty clear they didn't have 60 votes for it in the Senate, which was good news. They never did bring it to the floor, though that was one of the main reasons the unions were pushing hard for them to take the nuclear option and eliminate the filibuster by breaking the rules. That danger is quite a bit lessened with Republicans controlling the House. There's no point in blowing up the Senate if they can't advance their agenda anyway. So we're on a pretty safe defensive front on that bill. However, there's other defensive threats going on. I mentioned the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, when I began speaking. Their general counsel, Jennifer Abruzzo, continues to do bad things there in terms of trying to set precedents and guide rulemaking in order to turn back the clock 70 years to some of the worst abuses of the forced unionism system in the immediate aftermath of the National Labor Relations Act. In terms of the way that unions are organized, the coercive power they have to force workers under their thumb without a secret ballot vote, things like that she is pushing very heavily, that we continue to fight from a legal perspective on the foundation side, from a legislative perspective on the committee side as well. In addition to that, one more fight going on right at this moment. Joe Biden has nominated a woman named Julie Su to run the Department of Labor. Julie Su was the headed the California's Department of Labor before coming here to D.C. she's currently the Deputy Secretary of Labor under Biden. In California, she was one of the architects of the disastrous AB 5 bill and policy, and one of its chief enforcers, that was designed to basically wipe out independent contracting and the gig economy. Guess why? Because working in the gig economy as an independent contractor, you're not subject to unionization. The unions couldn't force people to pay dues. Big shock. They don't like it when they can't force people to pay dues. So they created this bill in order to classify all of those people as employees so that they could be unionized and the unions could start taking money from them against their will. Julie Su was one of the chief proponents and architects of that and one of its chief enforcers. So that's a real problem. It's become a real problem for her as she's looking for a promotion at the Department of Labor, Looks like all of the Republicans are lining up against her. She got out of committee last week on a party line vote, with all Democrats voting for her, all Republicans voting against. They have not scheduled yet when they're going to bring her to the floor, because right now, as I record this for you, there are 3 Democrats who have not committed publicly to support her. They haven't said they'll oppose her either. They haven't made up their minds. Those 3 are Joe Manchin in West Virginia, Kyrsten Sinema in Arizona, John Tester in Montana. And there's some rumors that Angus King in Maine is also on the fence about this. So if you live in any of those states or know anybody in any of those states, it would be a great idea to call those 4 senators especially. Call all of them, but call those 4 especially. Give them a piece of your mind and tell them that Julie Su does not belong. Well, she doesn't belong in the Department of Labor at all, and she certainly doesn't deserve a promotion. So that's what's going on at the federal level. Of course, there's been a lot going on at the state level as well. I'm sure by now everybody knows that Michigan's right-to-work law has been repealed. That was certainly not good news. It was not too terribly unexpected, given the way things went out there in November. The election out there was sort of a perfect storm of disaster, starting with a supposedly but not really nonpartisan redistricting commission that created a whole bunch of new swing districts and a bunch of districts with advantages for Democrats, which made the process of creating a pro-big labor majority in the legislature much, much easier. In addition to that, there was the Republican primaries. The main candidates there really botched things and were thrown off the ballot for failing to get their signatures in time, leaving us with second-tier candidates, leaving Governor Whitmer a reasonably clear path to re-election. And on top of all that, there was an abortion-related ballot measure in which the other side had far more money and far more enthusiasm and really just out-muscled and out-organized the pro-life side. And as a result, Democrats not only elected Governor Whitmer, but big labor Democrats also took a 1-seat majority in both the state House and the state Senate. It probably goes without saying that none of them campaigned on repealing the state right-to-work law. That had been in place for 10 years at this point. It was popular all across the state, even with union members. But despite the fact that they didn't campaign on it, they didn't advertise to anybody that that was on their agenda, it was indeed one of the first things they set their hand to as soon as they took power. We mobilized grassroots across the state trying to see if we could flip at least one Democrat in one chamber, but it's hard anywhere as a Democrat to survive if big labor is against you, and it's particularly hard in Michigan. They could have voted it right, they could have stood with us and protected the right-to-work law, and then they could be sure that big labor would be doing everything in its power to metaphorically cut their throats in the next Democrat primary. So it was an uphill battle, and ultimately we did not prevail. However, I firmly believe there is a price that they are going to pay for that. Right-to-work law was popular. It had been in power for 10 years. Nobody believes the big labor propaganda that wages are going to go down and infant mortality is going to go up and all these other disaster scenarios, the sky is falling, that they claim about right to work when it's been functioning for 10 years. And not only did the state not get worse, in fact, things got a lot better, and they're in massive slump in jobs from the previous decade completely turned around, and they actually started making progress economically once again. I fear that progress is about to hit a roadblock, and the people of Michigan, I am confident, are going to exact a price from those politicians that voted against right to work, and we're going to get that right to work law back. Might not be won't be this year, might not be in 2 years, might be in 4, might be in 6, but we're going to get it back. So that's the state of play there. In Virginia, interesting things are going on. One of only 2 years with odd-numbered years state legislative elections. Some of you will recall that the big labor Democrats completely took over Virginia 3 years ago with a Democrat governor, state House, and state Senate, and immediately moved to repeal the state's ban on public sector monopoly bargaining. Virginia was one of just a handful of states that had the sound policy of saying, you know what, if you're a public employee, you can be in a union, But we're not going to bargain with that union. That union can be a lobbyist like any other lobbyist, but it doesn't get a special seat at the table when determining how to spend the public purse. Well, the Democrats, under Big Labor's tutelage, did away with that. Governor Youngkin, when he won Virginia's gubernatorial election, pledged to fight that, to repeal it and put our ban back in place. 2 years ago, the Republicans took over the state House, and again, on an agenda of fixing the damage those Big Labor Democrats did. Virginia is a little odd in that its state Senate is not up half of it every 2 years, but rather the whole state Senate is up every 4 years. And so this year, the whole state Senate and the whole state House are up for re-election. And again, this is Virginia voters' first chance to hold state senators accountable for the damage they did 3 years ago. And we are looking forward to watching that happen, and we are going to make sure that every Virginia Right to Work supporter knows who stands with us for freedom and for sound public policy, and who stands with the unions for more coercive power and sinking their claws deeper into the taxpayer's pocket. We are on offense in Montana, trying to pass a new state right to work law there. Excuse me. And Montana is an interesting situation. We have, I think, pretty clear majorities in the state House and the state Senate that would vote for the bill under normal circumstances. Our biggest roadblock there is the Republican governor. It's not that he opposes right to work, but he is putting it about that he does not want to see that bill on his desk. It's just not high on his priority list, you see, and he wants to focus on other things. And because of that, there's a number of legislators that are taking their lead from him and doing what they can to bury the bill and not get it to his desk. That's unfortunate. But we're going to keep pushing, we're going to keep fighting, and we're going to keep reminding both the governor and all of the politicians in the state that the people of Montana want right to work and that right to work would be good for them. Again, I don't know that we're going to get it this year, but we're going to get Montana in the near future. That brings us to New Hampshire, another state where we're on offense, but not quite over the finish line yet. We had the votes in the state Senate last year. We had a governor that was not only willing to sign it, but eager to sign it. And the Republicans had a decent majority in the New Hampshire State House last year. However, it was only about a dozen seats, and there were about 24 bad Republicans. Now, those sound like big numbers, but the New Hampshire House has 400 members. And it's a weird quirk of their constitution that every township gets one. And so it's a colossally huge body. So a dozen of them, a dozen seat majority isn't all that big. And on any given day when the right to work fight is not coming up anyway, several dozen might be missing. However, in this case, of course, we had a majority of Republicans, not a majority pro right to work, and the Republicans actually lost a dozen seats in the last election. So they went from small but comfortable majority to a one-seat majority now. And there are still, I don't know exactly how many, but more than one bad House Republican on right to work. So despite the fact that the Senate would pass it, despite the fact that the governor wants it, we're probably not going to be able to get it through the New Hampshire House unless something pretty significant changes up there over the course of this year. So we continue to be in put them on record and then hold them accountable mode. And of course, you've probably heard me say before in previous years, that's how we do things. This is the blocking and tackling of American politics. Force them to vote, then hold them accountable, then do it again, then do it again, then keep doing it again until we have the votes to change the world. So that's the plan in New Hampshire and pretty much everywhere else we operate, and we are definitely going to keep at it. Nevada has been a defensive concern for some time, but that concern is somewhat lessened now. New Governor Joe Lombardo is campaigned on a Protect the Right to Work platform, pledged that he would indeed have nothing to do with repealing right to work. And so no matter what Big Labor gets through the legislature, we've got a bulwark there. And so we're not done protecting Nevada, I don't think, or holding bad guys accountable out there. But for now, at least, the defensive threat is somewhat diminished. Wisconsin, on the other hand, the defensive threat is somewhat augmented. As many of you probably saw if you were watching the news, they just had an election for their Supreme Court out there, and Big Labor's candidate brought in millions, $6 million, $10 million of outside the state money in order to flip a state Supreme Court seat. Unprecedented sort of money on a state Supreme Court seat. The candidate was openly campaigning about how she would vote on particular issues, which if any of you have ever watched a Senate confirmation hearing on a Supreme Court candidate or any judge candidate, they commonly say, well, I can't answer that question because that case might come before me and I can't prejudice by how I might rule. Well, this woman running for the Wisconsin Supreme Court threw all of those rules of decorum and judicial practice out the window and actively campaigned on a political agenda. The Republican candidate did not do so, and I guess the unfortunate lesson is that throwing the left-wingers a bunch of red meat was a better mobilizing and organizing tactic than just talking about judicial restraint and traditional practice. And $10 million to $600,000 probably didn't hurt either. So the long and the short of that is we now have a big labor stooge tipping the balance of power on the Wisconsin Supreme Court, which puts Scott Walker's Act 10 from a dozen years ago in danger. That was the bill that reformed their public sector unionism out there and led to a bunch of good things happening. The state right to work law could conceivably be in danger. They could come up with some ridiculous argument that their state constitution prohibits it. It doesn't, but that doesn't usually stop activist judges. And most likely, or certainly probably soonest problem we're going to face out there is that the courts basically control redistricting, or at least they will under this new activist majority. And so they could force the state to redistrict in a way that gives big labor Democrats a significant advantage, which after the next election then puts everything we've achieved out there over the last decade or so in danger and in play. So there's a significant amount of concern out there about what's going to be happening in Wisconsin over the next couple of years. I don't know exactly how it's going to play out, except to say that right-to-work supporters will be engaged, will be involved, and will be fighting to protect the gains for freedom that they've made out there. A number of other offensive fights going on, a number of other defensive fights going on out there, state right-to-work laws in places that are perhaps less likely in the short term to pass them, but in the long term, well, we got to keep fighting for the long term. And so I mentioned the blocking and tackling, force them to vote, hold them accountable. That starts early. That starts sometimes a couple of decades before we're ready to pass a law. We start laying the groundwork. And so we're doing that in a number of places. We're also on defense in a number of places as well, just stopping this union power grab or that union power grab. They continue to try to whittle away at our Janus victory, where we won that victory that says that the government unions cannot force people to pay dues ever under any circumstances. And they're trying to come up with ways to force people to pay dues anyway within that framework in a number of states. So we're fighting that everywhere we see it, as well as a number of other related battles. So that's what's going on out there. I hope it was helpful to you, and good luck with everything you all are working on.